In this video, you will learn about function statements and expressions. So in the last video, where we first talked about functions, I always declared functions using function statements. But there's actually another way of writing functions in JavaScript, and that is by using function expressions. Okay? So all the logic of functions that I explained to you in the last lecture still work the exact same way. We just write the function in a slightly different way. And under the hood of JavaScript, it also works quite differently actually, but for now, that's not important for us. I just want you to know at this point that we have both function statements and expressions. So let me show it to you. And so when we write a function expression, we start by writing the function basically without a name. So we still use the function keyword, and then right after that, we put the arguments list. And so in this case, I want to pass in the job and the first name. Okay, and only then we basically assign this function to a variable. So we declare a variable, and this one I'm going to call what do you do. So basically it's a function where we pass in the job, and then the function tells us what that person does. So what do you do? So that is now a variable, and what we assign to that variable is simply this function. So function where we pass in job and first name, and then of course the function block. All right, so comparing that to what we had before, or actually let's write it out here. So that is a function expression. And if we did the same thing as a function declaration, then we would write function, what do you do, and then the arguments list. So something like this. Okay, so you see the difference? Okay, so let me comment this out here. So this is just so you know what the difference between a declaration and an expression is. And again, the way that we call the function and the way that we pass in the parameters and all that stuff that you learned before still works the exact same way with function expressions. All right, so let's now use a switch statement here so that you can practice some different stuff that we learned before. And we will do something similar to the switch that we had before actually. So we're going to switch the job here, and then our different cases will be for, let's say, teacher. And let's add the cases here before. So case teacher, then we have driver, then we have designer, and then finally the default case if none of the before apply. All right. Now, the other time where we did this similar switch, we had a console.log and then a break. But this time we're going to actually return something. So let's say we want to return first name plus the string that we had before. So teaches kids how to code. Okay, and now we will actually not have to include the break. That is because of something that I didn't tell you before. That is, when we hit the return keyword here, then we return whatever we define after it. But what also happens is that the function immediately finishes. So basically, we immediately go out of the function and return to the place where we actually called the function. Okay, so the return keyword does not only return the value, but it also immediately finishes the function. Okay, and so we do not need the break here. So in case that the job is teacher, then we return this string here and then immediately exit the function. All right, now in case that the job is a driver, well, then we return something else. Okay, and so in that case, this line here is never executed, obviously, and so it's not going to finish the function, and instead it will come to this next case, which is driver. So first name, and let's say drives a cab in Lisbon. Then the same thing for the designer. Designs beautiful websites. And then finally the default case. Does something else. Okay, so let's now give it a try. So just like before, we call our function what do you do, and then we pass in the job and the first name. So let's pass in teacher, and of course John. And don't forget that this function here returns something, and so we should save that somewhere. All right, or instead of saving it, we can of course also simply log it to the console. So let's do that instead. Okay, so that's something that we didn't do before. So immediately log to the console the result of calling this function. Okay, but that just works the same. So in this case, what we will return here is the string John teaches kids how to code, right? And so that will then be logged to the console. So exactly like I said, this is the string that we expected, right? And now, of course, we can do this multiple times. So let's say designer, Jane, and then, well, we can say that Mark is retired. So let's see what happens now. So Jane designs beautiful websites, and then Mark does something else, which is the default clause here. So again, you see how useful it is to be able to reuse all of this code. Otherwise, we would have to basically write this here 3 times if we wanted to have this scenario with 3 people and 3 different jobs. And like this, we simply pass to the function the things that change, basically. So what's different here is the job and the name for each of these cases. And so that's what we passed into the function, both the job and the name. And then based on that, the function does something, which is in this case, produce a string and then returns it. So again, we can always see a function like a machine that receives something, then does something with the data and gives back something different. Okay, so this is how we write a function expression. Now, statements and expressions, they do not only apply to functions, but they are a global concept in JavaScript actually. So before moving on, let's talk a bit about the difference between statements and expressions. So JavaScript expressions are pieces of code that always produce a value. And it doesn't matter how long they are, as long as the code results in a single value, and then it is an expression. So let's take a look at that in the console here. And so, for example, if we simply write 2 plus 3, well, then you see that this produces a result, so a 5 in this case. And so what we just wrote here is a JavaScript expression, okay? And the same is when we, for example, call this function. So let's call this function right here in the console, and we actually have access to these functions here right in the console, okay? So that's something that we didn't do up until this point, basically using the variables and function that we define here in our code right in our console, but we can do that, okay? And so when we now call this function here, then you see that, of course, it returns a value. And so again, this function call here is an expression. And really anything that we do, again, that produces a result is an expression. So for example, type of 23, and it gives us back this result of number. And so again, this is an expression, all right? So what this means is that whenever JavaScript expects a value, we always have to write an expression. Okay, and the importance of this whole concept might be a bit hard to grasp at this point for you, okay? But it's really important to learn this stuff for the future, all right? So for example, here in this if-else statement, for example here, JavaScript of course expects a value here. And so this here needs to be an expression, and of course it is, because this operator here will of course return true or false. And so that is a result, and so therefore it's an expression. Okay, now anyway, about statements, they do just perform actions. So they do things, but they do not produce immediate results. So these are things like if-else statements, a while loop that we're going to talk about later, or even a function declaration. They don't produce any immediate value, and so they are called statements. So let's again take a look at that here in the console. And I'm going to write a very simple if-else statement here. So let's say if true, and so this if block here will of course be entered. So let's write console.log here of just some numbers, some random stuff. So it doesn't really matter here. And so let's hit return. And you see now here that what this returns is undefined. Okay, so it doesn't really return anything. But this 23 here simply comes from this console.log here. But the statement itself, it does not return anything. So it's just really this statement that doesn't produce a result. And so that's the difference between expressions and statement. All right, so coming back to functions here, we learned that function expressions produce an immediate result, while function declarations do not. And this will actually be very important for certain situations that you're going to learn about later in the course. So in these 2 lectures, we covered the very basics of functions, but of course there's a whole lot more to learn about functions. But again, I will leave that for a bit later in the course. so that we're now ready to move on to another huge and exciting topic, that is arrays.